It's going to disappoint them to hear that I did this.
A peaceful day at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport was shattered when a Bombardier Q400 passenger plane suddenly shot into the sky without authorization. However, the person controlling that aircraft was not a trained pilot. He was just a baggage handler, with only a vague understanding of flying planes from video games. The entire airspace immediately descended into chaos. Flights were delayed, 2 F-15 fighter jets were dispatched to intercept, and a terrible aviation tragedy seemed imminent. What unfolded next was not a typical terrorist act or a regular hijacking, but a breathtakingly daring performance involving sharp maneuvers, dives, and even a barrel roll that astonished even seasoned combat pilots. What drove a friendly man to carry out such a reckless and desperate act? And how could a ground service agent manage to take off and control such a complex machine alone in the night sky? Richard Russell was not a professional pilot, nor was he someone trained to handle a large aircraft. He was just a ground service agent for Horizon Air, spending his days loading luggage, towing planes, and taking care of the heavy work few people noticed. His coworkers called him Beebo, a nickname that sounded more friendly than dangerous. On the surface, Russell's life carried no signs of anything unusual. He married young, once ran a small bakery with his wife, and later moved to Washington to settle down and stay closer to her family. It was the picture of an ordinary American man in his late 20s, simple, cheerful, and sometimes writing short blog posts about a job that was exhausting yet full of small adventures. But that same behind-the-scenes job gave him something most people would never have: direct access to commercial aircraft. Day after day, he walked past cockpits, glanced at rows of switches and blinking gauges. No one imagined that such harmless exposure would one day become the key to one of the strangest and most shocking events in modern U.S. aviation history. On the evening of August 10, 2018, at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, Russell began his shift like any other. Yet only a few hours later, he would step away from the image of a regular worker and into the role of the central figure in an unauthorized flight that would shake the entire nation. Richard Russell clocked in during the afternoon, cleared the security checkpoint at 2:36 p.m., and moved across the busy airport grounds like thousands of workers before him. Nothing in those first hours suggested that anything unusual was about to happen. At around 7:15 p.m., Russell drove a tow vehicle to the northern cargo area of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Parked there was a Horizon Air Bombardier Q400, a twin-engine turboprop normally used for regional flights. The plane had finished a trip earlier that day and was not scheduled to fly again, which meant it sat quietly, unattended, waiting for its next assignment. Russell climbed inside at 7:19 p.m. and began running through the steps to start the aircraft, a procedure he had no license to perform. Within minutes, the massive propellers came to life, and by 7:27 p.m., he used the tow vehicle to align the aircraft with the taxiway. At 7:32, he re-entered the cockpit, and only a minute later, the Q400 rolled forward and lifted off runway 16C. Witnesses on the ground were stunned as the unauthorized takeoff unfolded, with some Alaska Airlines employees reporting smoke from the wheels as the plane rushed down the strip. By the time the control tower realized what had happened, Richard was already in the air. The sudden flight forced an immediate response. Air traffic controllers scrambled to make contact, worried not only about the man's intentions, but also about the risk to incoming and outgoing flights at one of the busiest airports in the country. Within 45 minutes, 2 F-15 fighter jets were launched from Portland, racing north at supersonic speed to intercept the stolen aircraft. They were armed and prepared for the worst, though orders were clear: they should not shoot unless absolutely necessary. As Richard climbed higher, conversations with the tower revealed the strange mix of excitement and despair driving him. He joked that he knew a little about flying because of video games, yet he also admitted he had no plan to land. Controllers suggested he divert to McCord Field or Tacoma Narrows, two airports with runways long enough to handle the Q400. But Richard refused, saying he was afraid of causing harm if he attempted a landing. Down below, Seattle-Tacoma International shut down flights temporarily, creating chaos for passengers who had no idea why their trips were delayed. On radar screens, the Q400 became a flashing reminder of how fragile aviation security could be when one insider decided to cross the line. Russell, alone in the cockpit, had turned an ordinary evening into a crisis that reached the highest levels of national security. The stage was now set for the most unusual radio exchange between a control tower and an unauthorized pilot in modern history. What would Richard reveal about his state of mind once he started talking, and how would his words shape the way the world remembered him? Once Richard was airborne, his voice over the radio revealed the strange mixture of calm and despair that defined the rest of his flight. Controllers made contact quickly, asking basic questions about altitude and fuel, but his replies were nothing like the responses of a trained pilot. He joked that everything was peachy clean and compared the flight to video games, laughing as if it were an adventure, not a crisis. The longer he spoke, the more his words drifted between excitement and quiet resignation. He admired the view of the Olympic Mountains, calling them gorgeous, as though he were on a sightseeing trip rather than carrying out an act that could end in disaster. In another moment, he asked for the location of a mother orca and her calf that had recently made national headlines, a request that seemed almost childlike. Then, without warning, he apologized to his loved ones, saying he was a broken guy with a few screws loose, an admission that stripped away the humor and exposed his inner pain. Air traffic controllers tried everything to keep him talking. They offered step-by-step guidance, suggested airports for landing, and even called in a pilot to answer technical questions. He was polite and even thanked them for their patience, but each answer showed that he had no intention of bringing the plane back safely. Behind the light conversation was the ticking clock of fuel consumption. Richard admitted he had only a limited supply, noting that it was burning faster than expected. He acknowledged that his decision would disappoint many who cared for him, repeating that he wanted to say sorry to each and every one. Observers listening later would notice how Richard moved between two states of mind. At one moment, he was laughing about barrel rolls or asking about turbulence, and in the next, he was speaking of guilt and brokenness. This unpredictable swing kept controllers engaged, hoping that if they could extend the conversation long enough, he might reconsider. But with each passing minute, his language made it clearer that he viewed the flight as a one-way journey. For more than an hour, the world below listened to a dialogue that was part comedy, part confession, and part farewell. His words have since been studied not only for what they revealed about his intentions, but also for the larger questions they raised about human vulnerability. Why did a man who seemed cheerful to his friends use this moment in the sky to reveal his deepest despair, and what happened next when words gave way to dangerous action? The most unforgettable part of Richard Russell's flight came when he began performing stunts that should have been far beyond his ability. Flying a Bombardier Q400 is no simple task, even for trained pilots, yet witnesses on the ground soon saw the large turboprop banking hard, looping in wide arcs, and then attempting something no one expected. Moments later, he pushed the plane into a climb, tipped it on its side, and spun it through the air, Spectators holding cell phones caught the maneuver on video, their voices filled with disbelief as the aircraft turned completely upside down. The Q400 dove nearly straight toward the water, its engines roaring, before leveling off just 10 feet above the surface. Experienced pilots watching later admitted the move was surprisingly well executed and could have torn the wings off if mishandled. For a man with no license and no professional training, the stunt was both terrifying and astonishing. The scene shocked the F-15 pilots sent to intercept him. One reported over the radio, he cleared the water by about 10 feet, while another responded in disbelief, "Confirm he did a barrel roll?" These hardened fighter pilots had seen countless aerial maneuvers, but never one like this from a commercial passenger plane in civilian airspace. Even as military jets shadowed him, Richard continued to treat the sky as his private stage, mixing danger with a kind of reckless joy. Other moves followed, including sharp dives and steep climbs that pushed the Q400's engines to their limits. Onlookers described the aircraft looping and twisting in ways that seemed impossible for such a large machine. The recording spread quickly online after the crash, turning the flight into one of the most unusual performances ever witnessed above American soil. What stood out most was the contradiction. A man who claimed he had no plan to land was also demonstrating control most people would not believe possible. Aviation experts later debated how he managed such feats. Some argued he must have spent hours on flight simulators, practicing techniques that gave him just enough confidence to try them in reality. Others pointed to his job on the ground, where he might have observed procedures and learned more than anyone realized. Regardless of the source, the maneuvers proved that Richard had prepared in ways that were not visible to those around him, and this fueled larger questions about how secure airports really were. The barrel roll became the moment that defined his flight, the line between spectacle and tragedy, and it remains one of the most studied clips of modern aviation. But behind the daring moves was the unavoidable truth. His fuel supply was running out, and the end of the journey was approaching fast. What would happen when the performance ended and there was nothing left to keep the plane in the air? The biggest mystery after Richard Russell's flight was how a man with no pilot's license managed to handle such a complex aircraft. A Bombardier Q400 is not a small trainer plane, but a 76-seat turboprop that requires years of instruction and strict certification. Yet Russell not only took off without trouble, but also performed moves that stunned experienced aviators. To understand how he did it, investigators looked closely at his past and the clues he left behind. Some coworkers remembered moments that seemed odd at the time, but became clear later. One pilot recalled catching Russell inside a parked cockpit with another crew member, flipping switches and exploring the controls. In another case, he showed unusual interest in learning the pilot's flows, the routine steps used before departure. These details suggested that even though he was officially a ground worker, he was quietly gathering knowledge whenever he had the chance. Investigators also discovered his history of online searches. Russell had watched tutorials on YouTube and likely used consumer flight simulators available on gaming platforms. While no game can fully recreate the weight and pressure of a real aircraft, some experts admitted that advanced simulators can teach a person how to start engines, taxi, and even take off. This mix of digital practice and first-hand observation may have given him the confidence to try the impossible. Aviation experts were split on the question. Some believed that his control of the Q400 showed he had practiced for months on his own. Others argued that luck played as much of a role as skill, pointing out that one mistake in his barrel roll could have destroyed the plane instantly. Even the CEO of Horizon Air said he could not explain how Russell achieved what he did. The debate continues, but what is certain is that the event exposed gaps in how airlines monitor and train their employees. The story of his hidden skills raises larger concerns about security and human behavior. If one ground agent could learn enough to fly a commercial aircraft, what does that say about the risks in today's aviation system? And what would happen when his final moments in the cockpit revealed not just ability, but also his true intentions? The final minutes of Richard Russell's flight revealed a shift from reckless adventure to tragic resignation. As the stolen Q400 circled above Puget Sound, the voice that once joked about video games and barrel rolls began to sound heavier, filled with pauses and a tone of surrender. Controllers who had been clinging to hope realized that Richard was no longer treating the flight as a game. Instead, he was preparing himself for an ending that seemed inevitable. Fuel gauges inside the cockpit confirmed what his words suggested. The twin engines had been pushed through dives, climbs, and a barrel roll, burning far more fuel than a routine trip would ever require. Richard admitted openly that he was running low, telling the tower that the numbers were dropping faster than he expected. One engine, he said, was already weaker than the other, and his comments made clear he had no intention of turning back toward safety. This was not a negotiation, it was a countdown. At 8:46 p.m., after more than an hour of flight, the stolen turboprop began its fatal descent. Radar screens showed a sudden drop in altitude, and seconds later, the Q400 slammed into the wooded edge of Ketron Island, a small, sparsely populated patch of land in Puget Sound. The impact tore the aircraft apart and ignited a fire that spread across 2 acres of brush and trees. Thick smoke rose above the island, visible to residents on nearby shores who had been following the drama on news reports. Despite the violence of the crash, no one on the ground was harmed, a fact that investigators later described as a grim stroke of luck. For first responders, the location created unusual challenges. Firefighters from West Pierce Fire and Rescue had to wait for ferries before crossing to the island, and by the time they arrived, the plane was already reduced to wreckage. The fire continued to burn into the night, and crews worked through thick undergrowth to contain the flames. Among the scattered debris, investigators found remains that were later confirmed by the medical examiner as belonging to Richard Russell. His cause of death was listed as multiple traumatic injuries, and the manner of death was ruled a suicide. Data from the flight recorder gave a clear picture of what happened in the last seconds. Instead of pulling back on the control column, which would have lifted the nose of the aircraft, the input moved further forward. This proved that the descent was intentional, not the result of loss of control. Investigators stressed that Russell had both the altitude and the time to recover if he had chosen to. The evidence left no doubt. He had decided the flight would end on Ketron Island. The FBI quickly ruled out terrorism, conspiracy, or outside help. They described the incident as the action of one man acting alone, driven by personal turmoil rather than ideology. His access to the plane came from his job, his knowledge came from curiosity and simulators, but the decision to crash was entirely his. The official investigation closed with more questions about motive than answers, leaving family, friends, and the public to wrestle with the meaning of his final act. For his loved ones, the confirmation brought heartbreak but no closure. They remembered a man who was playful, caring, and deeply faithful, not someone plotting a public tragedy. Horizon Air co-workers echoed the same confusion, recalling a colleague who smiled through long shifts and lent a hand without complaint. Reconciling that memory with the man who deliberately ended his life in a stolen aircraft proved almost impossible. In the gap between those two images lay the mystery that still surrounds Richard Russell. The crash marked the end of his flight, but also the beginning of wider debates about aviation safety, mental health, and the unseen burdens carried by ordinary workers. In the days after the crash, Richard Russell's story spread far beyond the Pacific Northwest and captured attention worldwide. Videos of his flight, especially the barrel roll, went viral online, and soon people began calling him Sky King. Memes, t-shirts, and tribute songs appeared on social media, turning a tragic event into a strange form of modern folklore. For some, he became a symbol of defiance, while for others he was simply a reminder of how hidden struggles can lead to sudden collapse. His family released a statement describing him as a warm and compassionate man who was deeply loved. They asked the public not to see him only through the lens of that final night, but to remember his humor, kindness, and faith. Friends echoed the same, saying the Richard they knew was generous and caring, which made his actions even harder to understand. The contrast between the private man and the public figure added to the sense of mystery that still surrounds his legacy. At the same time, the public reaction was divided. Some commentators argued that praising him as Sky King was dangerous, suggesting it might romanticize reckless behavior. Others believed the nickname reflected sympathy rather than admiration, a way of expressing compassion for someone who was clearly in pain. This debate highlighted how society often struggles to respond when tragedy and spectacle collide in the same moment. Experts also noted how the case revealed larger issues. Mental health in high-pressure jobs, weak oversight of ground employees, and the role of online communities all came into focus. Russell's death forced both airlines and the public to ask if there were missed signs that could have prevented the event. The continuing discussions showed that the impact of his story went far beyond a single night in 2018. The memory of Richard Russell lives on in a way few expected, as both a cautionary tale and a folk legend shaped by the internet age. But while people argued about his image, officials turned to more practical questions. How could a single worker bypass airport security and take control of a plane? Richard Russell's actions exposed weaknesses in aviation security that shocked both officials and the public. He was not a pilot, yet his job gave him access to aircraft cabins, tow equipment, and ground procedures. Investigators later confirmed that he passed through security without raising suspicion, showing how insider threats can be just as dangerous as external attacks. The fact that one employee could move from the ramp to the cockpit and take off without resistance forced airlines to rethink how they monitor their staff. After the incident, federal agencies and the FAA reviewed ground operations more closely. Airlines introduced stricter background checks and reinforced training for employees who worked near planes. Some airports also limited direct access to aircraft, requiring additional oversight for anyone entering a cockpit. These changes highlighted the lesson that aviation safety depends not only on passengers and pilots, but also on every worker behind the scenes. The case also invited comparisons with earlier events. In 1999, a teenager in Florida stole a small Cessna 172 and flew for half an hour before crashing. In 2002, a 15-year-old student managed to take a small plane into the side of a building, though no one else was harmed. On a larger scale, tragedies like Germanwings, Flight 9525 in 2015, and Silk Air 185 in 1997 showed how pilot suicide could bring down entire aircraft, proving that security is not only about fences and ID badges, but also about human stability. What made Russell's case unique was the combination of a commercial aircraft, a major airport, and a worker trusted by his employer. It showed that even without a terrorist plot or criminal plan, one person's private struggle could create a national emergency. The lessons drawn from the Q400 theft were not just about locks and checkpoints, but also about mental health awareness and the need for constant vigilance. Russell's flight left behind not only shock and sorrow, but also urgent questions for the industry. If tighter rules and technology cannot fully prevent such incidents, then how should society balance security with trust for those who keep airports running every day? The story of Richard Beebo Russell does not end with the smoldering wreckage on Ketron Island. It echoes in the uneasy silence that follows a question without a satisfactory answer. He was not a terrorist nor a master criminal, but a friendly ground agent who, in a final, desperate act, became a paradox that defies easy categorization. The Sky King folklore that emerged, while controversial, speaks to a public grappling with the same duality that baffled his loved ones. How could a man described as compassionate and faithful also be the architect of such a reckless, spectacular demise? His flight was a breathtaking, terrifying performance that exposed critical chinks in aviation's armor, prompting immediate security reforms concerning insider threats. Yet, the most profound legacy of that night extends beyond stricter access controls. It serves as a haunting reminder of the hidden struggles that can reside behind a cheerful facade and the catastrophic intersection of human vulnerability with systemic oversight.